So thank you everybody for joining. I'm Colleen McCulloch on behalf of Soil Association Scotland, and we're here talking about soil health today as part of a wider kind of short programme called Reducing Inputs. And we're going to hear from speakers Audrey Litterick, Alex Brewster and Doug Christie about their journeys with soil management. So there's a sort of lot of increasing interest in soil management at the moment, increases in prices of fertiliser and synthetic inputs, and just an increase in regenerative, organic, agroecological approaches to farming. I think a lot of organisations and people are seeing a sort of increased interest in soil health, managing soil health, and kind of more diverse ways to manage soil health. So we've kind of put together this short programme to highlight some of the people that are managing their health whilst also reducing their synthetic inputs, and kind of learning a lot of things along the way. So I'll do a quick run through of the agenda. So do a sort of quick welcome, a quick interactive poll that will take people through, and then we'll hear from Audrey, Alex and Doug, who I'll introduce when we get to that bit, and then we'll try and keep the last half an hour for sort of discussion and questions. So we can use the chat function for questions, and we'll also be able to use Menti for questions as well. And the Soil Association is sort of organising this series of webinars and soil farm walks, and that's a charity working with everyone to transform the way we eat, farm and care for the natural world. So Soil Association in Scotland and across the UK does a lot of work with farms around knowledge exchange, advice, plus the certification side, but also a lot more broadly around policy, food, public procurement, and a whole load of other things in between. And this short programme has looked at things like integrated pest management, quite a focus on soil so far as well, integrating livestock into arable systems, and themes like sort of diversity, complexity, soil health, thinking differently, exchanging knowledge with other people are sort of recurring themes that have kept popping up. So you don't need to read all the text in that slide, but it's funded through the Scottish Government's Knowledge Transfer Innovation Fund, to which we're grateful. So before we start hearing from the speakers, if people are able to either use their mobile phone or open a new page on their web browser and go to menti.com and enter the code, I'm not sure that that's the right code actually, but Jane has just popped the proper code in the chat. So you can either click on the link that Jane has popped in the chat bar, or go to menti.com and put in the code 64751338, not the one that's on my screen, and we'll do a very quick poll just to see sort of who we've got in the audience, what are people interested in, and that'll just give us a bit of a sense of what people are looking for out of today and where they're coming from. So yeah, we're seeing a bit of a mixture. So hopefully, if anybody has problems, you can pop something in the chat there, and we can help with any issues. But it looks like a few people managing to answer. So we've got a lot of livestock, some mixed. I think we've got quite a mixture of people in the audience that were coming from sort of advisory backgrounds as well, research backgrounds. We'll give it another wee second yet. No arable yet. Horticulture. Yeah, so quite a mix of people then in the audience, so that's good to know. And then hopefully your slide on Menti, if you're in it, should have gone to the next question. What are you most interested in learning more about? So if you just type in 2 or 3 words or phrases, that should come up on the screen as a kind of word cloud, just to get a sense of the things that folk are interested in. It always takes a wee second for things to start popping through. Yeah, so I think we'll talk a bit about most of these, maybe less so carbon sequestration, but that'll probably come into it a bit. Regenerative agriculture, I'm quite sure that'll come up. Soil health, what we're here to talk about and ask each other about. Cover crops, yeah, I think these are all things that will probably come into the chat. Yeah, so there's a lot of things about sort of regenerative, soil health, reducing tillage, reducing inputs. So yeah, that's reassuring that that's all sort of things that we'll be talking about. And for people in the audience who are farmers or growers or managing soil in some way, how do you assess the health of your soil? Do you do a kind of pH test, a soil test that goes to a lab? Do you dig a hole and look at worms? Does anybody smell their soil to see what it smells like? Visual, yep, soil testing. And this will be some of the things that Audrey will touch on a bit in her talk, is testing soil. How do you know whether it's healthier? Yep, spades, earthworms, structure, texture. All right, we'll move on to the next one. I think this might be the last one. Who is your main source of information? So because we do a lot of knowledge exchange, we're always interested to know whether the way we're communicating is the way that people receive their information or take it up most readily. And I think there's a sort of anecdotal split between types of farms and whether they speak more to agronomists and advisors or peer groups, or a big increase, especially in the last few years, of reading things online and articles and things. So yeah, a mixture there. So that's great. So at the end, after this webinar today, we'll be sending out a follow-up email in the next couple of weeks with lots of things for reading online, links to further information. So that's good to know that some people read them. And so I'm going to leave this, I'll stop sharing my screen in a second, but I'm going to leave this question slide on Menti, and you can leave that open through the presentation to ask a question. So on my screen, there's a little speech bubble at the bottom here. So it might be in the middle of your screen or at the bottom, that if you click on that, you can type a question. And then once there's a few questions there, they'll have thumbs up symbols beside them, so you can vote for other people's questions as well. So after we've heard from the speakers, we'll come back to these questions and use that to sort of start off the discussion. And so if you see questions that you think, oh, I want to know the answer to that, click like on them. And I'll stop sharing now. Right. So I think everyone should be able to see a bank of lots of faces now, hopefully. Audrey, can you still hear me okay?
I can, yeah.
Oh, good, lovely. Right, so yeah, next we're going to hear from our three speakers. So the first of which is Audrey Litterick, who works with Earthcare Technical, but also you've got lots and lots of hats that you wear, I think, and is a very knowledgeable specialist in quite a broad range of stuff, all relating to soils, compost, soil testing, crops, horticulture, organic production. The list goes on, but we're going to hear a bit from you about soil health testing and that kind of thing. So Jane is going to share the screen for your slides.
Thanks very much.
And I'll put myself on mute and let you introduce yourself. Thanks, Audrey.
Thanks very much. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Audrey Litterick, as Colleen said. I'm going to be speaking about soil health, how to measure it and how to manage it. And Jane's actually going to be changing my slides. So next slide, please, Jane. Briefly, I'm going to be talking about soil health. How do we define it? How do we measure it? And how important it is to test your soils for health parameters to get good baseline data, because you can only understand really what's happening if you've got that baseline data and you can measure soils for future changes. I'll also briefly mention the best ways to destroy your soil health. It's all too easy, what not to do. And also I'll be talking about ways to improve and maintain it. Next slide, please. So first of all, I want to define what soil health actually is. Next slide, please. What it actually is. So I basically mean it's much wider than just can I see soils that are looking healthy and am I going to get good crops out of it? It's wider than that. So it's the capacity of a soil to function as a vital living system. So to be good at providing ecosystem services as well as sustaining plant and animal productivity. It's also about maintaining and enhancing water quality and air quality. So as managers of land, managers of soils, we've got a responsibility to the planet, really, not just to ourselves to produce good quality crops. So it's to promote plant and animal health, including our own health, which is absolutely dependent on the health of the soil. Next slide, please. So the life in our soil is very much one of nature's miracles. And that's the difference between our planet and somewhere like the moon or Mars. You get lots of people talking about how nice it would be to go and live on the moon or live on Mars. It would not. It would be absolutely horrible. And one of the main reasons is that there's no soil. So life would not be as we know it at all. It's entirely dependent, our life here, on our soils. But unfortunately, we've got rather too many soils which look a bit like this one. So many intensively farmed soils in the UK have been damaged so badly that they're no longer functioning well. They're not providing good ecosystem services, and they're not providing a good place for us to produce our crops and also our livestock. Yields have become very inconsistent in some parts of the country, particularly when we're seeing extremes of weather. That's when we find out quite how bad some of our soils have become. Yields are often low as well as inconsistent. Next slide, please. So we now know that to keep soils healthy, we've got to keep feeding all the bugs that are in there, from the very smallest microorganisms up to the mesofauna, things like mites and springtails and tardigrades, right up to the large things like earthworms. We've got to feed them in order to keep our soils healthy. Next slide, please. So the soil health is it's not just about biology. We've got to look after the soil life, the biology, but the biology will not thrive unless we also look after the physical and chemical aspects of soil health. We've got to make sure that they're all working together so that our crops can thrive. So the biology, the chemistry, and the physics of soils are very closely interlinked. So if we're wanting to measure these things, we've got to try and choose the most appropriate parameters to actually work out what our soils are like in terms of the health. There's lots of things that you can do, lots of things that we can measure. Some of them are very expensive, very time consuming. So we've got to choose a suite of parameters, some chemical ones, some physical ones, some biological ones, to give us a good measure of how healthy our soils are. Next slide, please. The very first measure is to get good baseline data. And it never fails to amaze me how many farmers have actually not got good baseline data. It's quite a shock to me, really, to realise that many farmers are talking about organic matter levels, but they've not actually measured their soil organic matter. And they talk anecdotally about it having increased, but they've not actually got any figures on it. So we've really got to, at the start of any journey into learning more about our soils, you've got to get good baseline data. Next slide, please. So as I've said, we want to get these are some of the indicators of soil health. There's lots of physical ones, lots of chemical ones, lots of biological ones. Physical, that's the ones that we actually do ourselves using a spade, for example, or a compaction probe, or a water infiltration machinery. I would say some of the easiest ones are to get a visual evaluation of soil structure, simply using a spade and learning how to do it. Some people do use a compaction probe, something like a Dickie John, but again, that's only really useful if you learn how to use it in your soils and you do a lot of compaction measurements. Another test would be water infiltration, where you bury a piece of drainage pipe, not the ones with the holes in it, but a solid piece of plastic pipe in the soil, pour a known volume of water into it, and then simply measure the time that it takes the water to drain right through. And that differs very much between a well-structured soil and a damaged, poorly structured soil. So those are some simple physical measurements. Chemical tests, frankly, normally, for most soils that are producing crops, the normal old-fashioned simple soil tests are all you really need to do. So soil pH, soil pK and magnesium status, or in England, you would say soil pK and magnesium indices. So slightly different soil test methods used for chemistry between England and Wales and Scotland. And soil organic matter, again, there's various ways of measuring for that. The most important thing is make sure that your lab, that you're using consistent test methods. So anybody who wants can ask me about that later on. And then the other biological stuff, earthworm numbers, very good way of looking at the biology of your soils, but to do it properly and to do it meaningfully, you do have to spend a bit of time if you want to get meaningful numbers on earthworms. So do it at the same time of year, for example, same parts of the field. You could also be looking at the number and diversity of microorganism populations. There's various labs, take samples of your soil and measure all that, but it's very expensive. And as yet, we don't have very good methods for interpreting that and relating it to what you actually need to be doing in terms of management. So that stuff, whatever some of the labs tell you, that stuff really is in its early stages. It's fascinating, but expensive. Next slide, please. So there's really no substitute for the bucket, spade, and the soil auger. You need to be using those regularly. Use your eyes, use your nose, use your hands to see and smell and feel the soil. And the more you do that, the more you'll get used to understanding what you mean by a healthy soil. Next, please. So good indicators of a healthy soil when you're using the spade would be the soil is soft, it's easy to dig, there's no hard, lumpy aggregates. You should be getting a lovely smell, not a horrible rotten egg smell. And you're looking for fairly dark colours because those darker colours are an indicator that there's good organic matter levels there. You should see no signs of waterlogging, so no signs of speckling like orange specks and grey patches as you dig down, and no rotten egg smell, as I said. You're looking for lots of earthworms, different species, and there's guides out there to help you recognise the fact that you do have different species. And lots of tiny insects, things like little springtails and mites, those beneficial organisms, some of which you'll see, some of which you won't. Next slide, please. One of the most important things, I don't know what happened there, my presentation's disappeared. Can other people still see it? No, it'll no doubt be back in a minute.
Coming back.
Next slide, please. One of the key things you're looking at, some of the best indicators of a healthy soil are what you see when you dig into the soil. So you're looking for, oh, I don't know what's happened here. I'll just continue to speak, but if you try and get this slide up, Jane, about soil structure. Soil structure is different to texture. So I noticed people had there on the Mentimeter poll, they're looking for, when they're looking at soil health, they're looking at soil texture and soil structure. Soil texture cannot change. So it's very important to know your soil structure. That's the percentage of sand, silt and clay. So whether it's a silt loam or a sandy loam or a sandy silt loam or a clay loam, that's the texture. That cannot and does not change. But you need to know your soil texture, because only then can you kind of interpret the results of other measurements that you're doing. Soil structure is a different thing altogether. That's the way in which the sand, silt, clay and humus combine to form aggregates of varying stabilities. And hopefully we can find our way down to the slide, this one, that's got some nice pictures in it. So there's a very good example of excellent soil structure at the top left. So lots of small aggregates, lots of air in there, able to get in there, lots of spaces for the water to penetrate and lots of spaces for the animals, small and large, to move about in there. And there's some slightly poorer soil there with some firm aggregates in the middle and some slightly disastrous zones in the other bottom left and the right hand side there with platy structure on the left, lots of compaction and firm compact ground under a plough pan on the right. Next slide, please. So good soil structures, very important to allow air and water to penetrate downwards and to allow roots to penetrate through the soil as well, and to allow nutrients to be drawn towards those plant roots, and to help the soil resist stress caused by heavy rain and the movements of animals and machinery over the surface. So there's lots of things that you can do to help preserve soil structure, which is so essential for good soil health. Next slide, please. So what is good soil structure? It's lots of little crumbs and small, fine, blocky aggregates that are relatively soft. The soil's easy to dig, but of course you shouldn't be digging it too much. I'll say a bit more like that about that in a minute. The roots should be dense and deep. The soil should have a rough surface, not a compact, firm surface. Just press the next slide button now, please. There should be no signs of waterlogging. Next slide. And the structure. So structure forming is a natural process, but it's very much influenced by management. So some of the best instances of soil structure you'll see will be under long-term pasture soils that are not tilled at all or not cultivated. Next slide, please. Poor soil structure, you're seeing large beds with few cracks and pores. Soil, coarse, blocky or prismatic structure, a massive structure, platy structure with horizontal plates. Soil's hard to dig. The roots are few, they're relatively shallow, and they grow in funny directions. The soil might be waterlogged or it might be very firm and hard on the surface. So these are really good indicators. This is what you should be looking for when you're looking for a healthy soil. You'll only get good biology if you've got good soil structure. So next slide, please. I'm going to go very quickly through this slide because I don't have much time, but this is what you should be looking at. Visual soil structure assessment, if you want to put numbers on it. And that gives you one of the guides that you can look at, the visual assessment of soil structure from SRUC. And that explains how to do that. Next slide, please. It's the wrong way. So then for chemical testing, there's no substitute for tests done by an accredited soils lab. You can go really quite fancy and look at, for example, the Albrecht testing methods, but I would say for most farmers, the straightforward kind of old-fashioned basic soil tests are fine. So that's relatively cheap. Soil pH, PK and magnesium, and organic matter. Next slide, please. Biological testing, there's lots more options out there. Some of them cost a fortune, and some of them are relatively new and are probably not as well developed in terms of an interpretation framework as we need them to be. But it's great that a lot of keen regenerative farmers and organic farmers are doing some of those more novel, expensive tests, like, for example, microbiology profiling and biodiversity profiling. We don't really know how to interpret them yet. So really some of the easiest, cheapest things to do would be simple earthworm counts. But you've got to use the same method every time, count at the same time of year, ideally in autumn when the soils are moist. And there's good references showing you how to do a basic method and stick to that same method every time. Next slide, please. Now there's one really important point here, and that's about sampling strategies. For quite a while, people were doing soil health baseline measurements by taking a soil sample across a whole field, by taking multiple little samples, by walking the field in a W pattern. and then sending those samples off to the lab, for example. So the problem with doing that is sometimes the in-field variability is so great that it's greater than any changes that you'll see in soil properties over, say, 5 years or even 10 years. So now what we're doing, that's fine for nutrient management. But if you're taking baseline soil health measurements and you want to measure changes in soil properties over, say, 5 years or 10 years, you're much better to take maybe 3, 4, 5, or even 6 GPS marked points in your field, keeping a note of the numbers, or using what 3 words to mark the center of a circle, and have 5-meter radius circles and just have them forever. And you take your multiple samples from within those circles. You can dig pits for soil structure there, you can dig for earthworm numbers, and you can take soil samples for organic matter from those points. It makes a much better set of baseline soil data from which you can measure changes in future. Next slide, please. Right, briefly at the end, I just want to say 1 or 2 things about, here's some of the best ways to damage your soils, and this is what has been done so very badly in some of the arable areas, particularly in the UK, much less so in mixed farms and much less so in livestock farms. We really only see serious damage to soils in livestock farms where we've got very intensive livestock farms. Excessive cultivations in any weather, bad. Use of mechanical cultivators such as rotavators and power harrows. These are smashing apart fungal networks. They're destroying soil structure, which is so important. Even walking or driving on soils, particularly in wet conditions, that can be very bad for soil structure too. Lack of organic matter returns, and that's what's damaged arable soil so very badly. When I was at agricultural college years ago, I was told that soil organic matter returns were not necessary and all we needed was synthetic fertilizers. And that's basically hydroponics. That's basically providing plants with simply the simple nutrients that they need. And that theory is fine, but the practice is not. We need that soil biology for our soils to function well. So we need organic matter returns. The other things, monocultures, bad. Close rotations where there's lack of diversity in rotation. These are a disaster for soil organic matter and therefore a disaster for soil structure and soil health. And use of pesticides. Unfortunately, we've got recent evidence now which has been reviewed, which has showed most pesticides, unfortunately, have an impact on non-target organisms. In other words, they have an impact on the biology, and they can be really bad for the beneficial organisms in the soil. I think this is just about my last slide, or second last slide. Next one, please. Strategies to maintain and enhance soil health. These are all the things that we know work. So bulky organic amendments, return them to the soil. So dungs, composts, for example, fiber digestates as well, anaerobic digestates. Also green manures and cover crops. Never leaving your soil bare where you can manage that. And I know that's particularly difficult in Scotland, and the further north you go, it can be very difficult to establish cover crops after cash crops. But where possible, keep your soil with as much diversity in it as possible, both during cropping and between cropping. Diverse crop rotations, no monocultures. It's been shown that where there's more diversity above ground in plants, then there's also more diversity and stronger microbial populations below ground. Return of crop residues rather than taking them off. For example, chopping straw and returning it, chopping crop residues and returning them. Reducing cultivations as much as possible, where possible even going to no-till, probably combined with controlled traffic farming if you can do it. Use of grazing ruminants in cropping rotations. There's increasing evidence that having animals in arable rotations is good for soils. Also biostimulants, there's quite a number of companies selling biostimulants, things like humic acids, fulvic acids, trichoderma, all different kinds of things. The jury is out on a lot of these things yet. I'm not at all convinced that we need to be replacing synthetic inputs with lots of those, but there's certainly a place for some of them. Okay, this really is the final slide now. So different strategies for different farms though. so last slide, please. It's important to note that the best suite of management techniques for improving soil health will differ depending on the farm, the farmer, the farming system, climate, the soil type. We do not have the research funding to do all the research that's required. And therefore, this farming revolution, which is happening just now, which is very exciting, I think, is being driven by farmers. And it's them that are getting together to chat about it, to talk about it, to run monitor farms and farmer groups. And it's important to keep trying new things. I've given you the framework there, but developing what works for you is going to be quite a personal thing. And that we'll see the biggest benefits if farmers are cooperative and increasingly ready to share what they've learned. So that's all I've got to say for now. Let's hear for some practical guys who are actually doing all this for real in the field.
Thanks, Audrey. That was great. And yeah, I think you covered quite a lot of ground in your 15 minutes there, and well done for keeping going seamlessly through our technical hitches there. That was really, really informative. Can we make sure, can people mute themselves, please, if you're not muted, just because there was wee bits of sound interference there. And we're going to pass over now to Alex Brewster at Rotmell Farm, who I'll let you introduce yourself, but we'll highlight that you were Soil Farmer of the Year in 2020, and I think a self-proclaimed regenerative farmer with rotational grazing with beef and sheep. So I'll let you introduce yourself and take us through the journey at Rotmell Farm and your kind of experience with managing your soil and how that's changed.
Right, hi, thank you for the introduction. I presume everybody can hear me.
Yes, we can, and we can see your slides.
Good, everyone's ready this end. So, yeah, thanks so much for giving me the opportunity to speak. I'm Alex Brewster. We farm at Rotmell Farm, which is in sort of central Perthshire, halfway between Pitlochry and Dunkeld, right above the River Tay, as you could see. I don't know if I'm self-proclaimed regen farmer. I've been given that label. I kind of regard myself as a livestock farmer, and really just pushing the envelope in terms of knowledge and systems thinking, and how we can optimize performance without having to maximize inputs. So, and I'm also massively passionate about getting the relevance of red meat and how we can produce really high quality nutrition from extensive grasslands. So here we go. This is where we started, 2013, 14, 15, really clumpy, tight soils, lack of biology, lack of microaggregates in there, as Audrey alluded to, and that would be a fairly standard visual of what our soils were when we were set stocking, pre any sort of rotational grazing or longer rotational grazings. We've come quite a way since then. So here's sort of principles that we adhere to. Context is everything, and each business in each farming system has its own context in terms of what's important to you. I'm really keen on optimizing what we do, and what I mean by that is reducing inputs, pushing live weight gain, fertility, fecundity as far as we possibly can within the beef and sheep side of things, but also extracting as much nutrient from the soil as we can by getting the biology and the fungal operation, and sequestering as much atmospheric N as we can into our soils. Keep soil covered, that's kind of a given in our environment. Weather's becoming really unpredictable. We need covered soils to stop dehydration in really hot summers, but also grab as much moisture as we possibly can. Living roots are essential. We need to keep the plants growing. We're also discovering, as a farm business, we're roughly 1,000 hectares. There's 200 hectares I can't do a lot with, and we're 130 hectares of improved grassland. In the middle bit there, where we're starting to break into what is really good upland and quite degraded LFA land, we're bringing back a huge amount of natural diversity into these hectares, and it's just through grazing techniques. Livestock are my main tool, along with electric fencing for subdivision and getting water installed in the right places. And we try to impact soils but not disturb soils, and that's a fairly fine line, and we can get ourselves on the wrong side of that line within a 12-hour period quite quickly in some wet weather. So here's a hole we dug last year. As you can see, there's quite a difference from the soil pit in 2022 in comparison to 2014. We've now got roots down much further. That's roughly 2 foot of soil there. The bottom of the photograph, you see we're in the subsoil zone, but we've got roots translocating right the way down into subsoil, and within that zone we're picking up a lot of the macro and micronutrients in the soils, and we're finding these in some fairly advanced soil tests, as well as some pastoral leaf tissue testing as well. There is, I don't know if you can see my mouse, but there's wee worm channels moving up and down through here. That'll be a worm channel there. Then the roots then translocate down through these worm channels. And when you see the darker bits of soil, that's the root exudates leaching out of the soil and starting to feed these microbial communities deeper down inside the soil. So, as a landowner, I think one of our primary responsibilities is to build soil capacity and to build topsoil. And here we're doing that by pushing roots down the way into the subsoil or zone B, but we're also a bit of trash on top. We're working pretty hard to sort out our carbon nitrogen ratios. We're trying to get a better balance of fungus and bacteria. Improved soils tend to be more bacterial driven, whether the rougher ground higher up is more fungal driven. That's just the historical context. Soil minerals, as I say, we've improved some of that twofold over a period of time, and we're seeing that in our plant tissue tests on an annual basis. And water hydrology is probably a far bigger issue than we ever discuss, in that we need to be able to capture massive amount of water when it comes, because rainfall is a bit intermittent. I mean, we've just entered early March. We were -8 here this morning, and we've had very little precipitation at all since January. So living roots, we've got to keep them in the soil. This is some of our rougher ground higher up. Again, this ground here used to be 50% moss, and you can see that there's the darker, rougher patches on the top, where we'd have quite a lot of bracken beds, quite a thick trash layers. Bacterially wise, there was very little happening there, and you can see again we've managed to drop root depths quite a way down into these soils, which I was told and I actually didn't think was possible to do. But over a 4-year period, we have done this, and it's really added a massive grazing capacity to the landscape. We can't do it mechanically. We've got to do it with livestock. So we've got to drive photosynthesis through the plants, producing surplus root exudates, which in turn are feeding the microbes in the soil. And it's these microbes that are creating the spore space and allowing and giving the worms the food source, but they're also allowing us to punch roots away deeper into some fairly challenging soils. In the simplest format, I mean, we're using electric fencing, and that's this 3-4 wire subdivision in the better country. In the higher country, we're running out reels on a daily basis. We're doing it all either on feet or off the back of our RTV stroke ATV. And with the use of electric fencing, we're able to influence a landscape, but we can't control it. When we get water put in the right places, we can then control animal movement better, which allows us to control and impact that landscape. Our biggest tool in our toolbox is creating time. The mantra of maximising the amount of grass grown is fundamentally wrong. We have to optimise it. The biggest form of livestock that we have on farm is the biology living in our soils, probably at least 100 times greater than the weight of biology grazing as it is livestock grazing above it. So we've got to feed the microbes. We've got to create these populations. They're making cells function for us, and the herbivore is a massive part in stimulating the ecosystem and that environment. So we can live by the mantra of eat, sleep, rotate, repeat. Diversity. Most of these photographs I'm going to show you today are all natural grasslands. There's nothing seeded here. We haven't gone in at all with a seed barrow. This is all country that's rough. It's stony. Mechanically, we couldn't drive in a straight line for any more than 50 meters without having to dodge away in a stone or a rock face. with the correct amount of applied rest, this is what we're getting back. So in a nutshell, diversity drives all life, and there's an epigenetic transition happens with grasses. We're trying to trample down as much seed as we possibly can. We've all got the plants on farm that we deserve, and some of the bigger tap-rooting plants, they're there because we've got compacted soils. I truly believe that soils are always trying to return back to a natural state where there's full functionality. I think we, as land managers, don't really understand what that looks like. We're visually conditioned to a kind of monoculture as prescribed to us by people selling fertilizer. So pastoral diversity unlocks the mineral capacity. Each of these plants is mobilizing a different microbial community. They're mobilizing a slightly different tranche of minerals, and all of that then becomes animal available. The more diverse your pastures become. The other big part of this is that initially we started off with genetics that were bred for a TMR and a concrete feed pad, and they've then had to adapt and change with the system as well. We've had to cull, or we have culled quite heavily through fertility or fecundity issues, and what we've got left with now is a cohort of breeding livestock that is extremely resilient to a more natural environment and fundamentally just don't need the inputs we used to be putting into them. So breeding for resilience within the cow and yow flock is massively important. And quite frankly, don't be afraid to be the wolf and cull out the bottom end as fast as you can afford to do. What's left in the middle will over time be the right genetics for the system. And we've increased soil organic matter content in the soil by about 4% over 5 or 6 years. And of that, and in a rough sum, in every 1% increase in organic matter is a sort of 50% increase in carbon capacity in the soil as well. It's given us access to about 1,800 pounds worth of minerals per hectare. The other little nugget which people seem unaware of is there's about 780 tonnes of atmospheric nitrogen above every hectare on the planet. And pastoral plants, or any growing plant, has the ability to sequester and stabilise that. The bacteria in the soil have the ability to sequester that atmosphere again. We've never applied. We have never bought bagged fertiliser, and yet we're producing more grass today than we were 15 years ago. Increasing organic matter. I'm actually not keeping a track of time, so if somebody wants to give me a shout in case I'm going to go over, please let me know.
Yeah,
so
another 5 minutes.
Okay, brilliant. So our journey, I suppose the biggest one there is you have to have the confidence to make mistakes and learn from the lessons. We've made plenty, or I've made plenty, and I very often run what we regard as £1,000 experiments, just trialing little wee bits and pieces. They don't all work. Quite a few of them fail. But as long as we learn lessons from these trials, then we're able to go forward and put in place bigger, more concise plans, put that investment in place, which is, so we're getting a return of investment for every pound that we spend on the farm, rather than spending money on, say, a synthetic input to nitrogen, for example, where it's a 50% loss. Half of what's applied to the ground is never utilised by the plant. So we have to earn the right to change. It doesn't just happen. It's a gradual process. Here we're kind of moving mob of cows through to a different pasture. The bracken in that photograph would at one point been 3.5 foot tall, and over sort of 2 or 3 year period, we've reduced that quite considerably to what is, I would think, a fairly manageable place right now. A lot more diverse grazing through there, and the stock get on pretty well. As I touched on at the start, the biggest tool in our toolbox is understanding the value of rest. We as farmers, land managers at times, I think we tend to be a bit greedy, and we try and take too much off and away from the landscape, and that's to the detriment of finding that optimum state. I have no problem trampling down 30-50% of what we grow. It armours the soil, it keeps the frost off, it captures moisture, it stops dehydration of soils. All of that in a changing environment are massively important. But also manage for what you want. If you want to grow good quality grass, then you've got to allow that grass to grow, or that pasture to grow. So the biggest limit, some of the biggest limits to business change is, I think, and we've been in this space as well, that so many people are locked into a prescribed way of farming. They're frightened not to use a product, and I kind of refer to that as a Stockholm syndrome, that you're frightened to go without. And over the last 5 or 6 years, I've kind of learned that the less products that we use, and the fewer times we interfere with a landscape, the greater return that we get. I touched on, we're all aware there's an epigenetic change in how livestock breed. There's also an epigenetic change in how pastoral plants seed as well. And as we build that capacity in the soils and a richer, deeper soil with a more available nutrient base, we're getting a far stronger array of seed banks. We're getting taller grasses, a thicker cover, and all of that, it just builds to the value, and I find each year quite exciting. So your managing mindset, ethos, values, massively important. Environmental resilience I touched on, that's just managing the varying weather we're getting today. But as we're using less products, growing more feeding animals better, we're getting a far stronger financial output from the business. I think to date, so far this year, we've reduced the feed bill by over 1,000. I think it's about £1,500 a month, which over a 6-month winter for us is massive. And then there's the social responsibility, and that's another major driver for myself, that I wish to create a business that I can offer towards my kids if they wish to farm. That is genuinely a really going concern, and they can take it on if they wish to farm into the future. So, in summary, and I'll whip through this quite quickly, for red meat to be green, we've got to build that capacity within a landscape and within soils. We've got to make sure we're managing the climate, environmental impact. We're not using synthetics. I agree with Audrey that I think that a lot of drenches, pour-ons that we use within the livestock sector are doing a massive amount of damage behind us. We've got to understand animal impact, what it is. We've got to mix up cattle grazing and sheep grazing to work our way around parasites and try and limit drainage resistance. We've got to create time and allow for genetic expression. And what I mean by that is, for those of us that are maybe buying in breeding replacements, be very careful who you're going shopping. If the breeders are not placing the same pressure on the livestock as you're doing at home, you may end up coming up a little bit short. And above all, this is a 10-year journey, and think well ahead. And in a nutshell, that's me. Look forward to any questions you've got for me later on. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alex. That was really interesting. Right, I'm just going to mute you so that it doesn't bounce back with the sound there. Yeah, I think, again, you managed to cover quite a lot in 15 minutes or so. And we're running a tiny bit over, but I think that's fine. And next, we're going to hear from Doug Christie at Durie Farms in Fife. And he's going to cover more of the kind of arable side of things. He's got a stockless arable system, but also has livestock, organic livestock as well. But I'll let Doug introduce himself, and it looks like you're successfully managing to share your screen, Doug, so that looks good.
Good afternoon, everyone.
Slide now. Right, thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. That's thanks, Alex. And I empathise with everything you said in your presentation, and I'll probably repeat a lot of what you said in part of mine. I'm a mixed farmer in Fife, on the fairly light soil around the fringe of Fife, on good arable land on the whole. I've got some rough bits at the top of the farm, but I've been farming for nearly 30 years now, and I went over to the dark side, probably the late 1990s, when I decided that I was going to radically change my farm, and so I stopped ploughing. And on 2/3 of the farm, which is the conventional part of the farm, I haven't ploughed since then. But on the other flip side of the coin, I haven't had any livestock on that part of the farm since then. But I'll get back to you later about that. So 2/3 of the farm have been pretty much direct drilled. It was a bit of minimum tillage, a very light minimum tillage to start with since then. But I realized after a few years of doing everything wrong, I learned the hard way of lightly cultivating soils when they're too wet, leaving too much of a period between cultivating and sowing. And in many cases, it rained in that period and my soils were stinking. I dug a spade up and it, as Audrey was saying, the sulfurous sort of smells coming out of the soils and so on. So I had to perhaps have a rethink about what I was doing. And so since then, I haven't basically gone on the soils when they're wet at all. And increasingly in the last 8 years, I've been direct drilling. But also not only that, farming is a very complex business, but I've been incorporating cover crops into the soil, increasingly using companion cropping, practicing companion cropping, and a lot of the times it doesn't work, but I can see the benefits of it, so I'm persevering. I'm not just one of those people that if there's a good reason and scientific research done on it, on companion cropping, after a year, I don't say, oh, it doesn't work for me, I'm not going to try it again. There's got to be a very good reason why it doesn't work, and I'm going to give it its best shot. Also, I have changed the rotation. I suddenly realized with a lot of trash-borne diseases that I can't grow continuous spring barley because of the rhynchosporium problems there in that situation. And going on to the other third of the farm, which is mainly permanent pasture. In 2006, I converted to organic on that part of the farm. I have grown a small area of organic crops every year on that part of the farm, but I've been using the plow on that. And after a visit to the States in 2014 and 15, and again in 2018, I suddenly realized mob grazing seemed to be a no-brainer in theory. So in 2019, early 2019, I went down that route. And I don't know whether I call it mob grazing or adaptive multi-paddock grazing, but all the cattle have been moved daily with increasing rest periods throughout the year from June especially. So that's me starting off in 1998. I was going hell for leather. I thought I'd crack that out. This is the way to go. But beware, there are pitfalls and limitations in direct drilling. You've got to stop sowing in the autumn a lot earlier, and in the spring you've got to watch you don't go in too early. That's a field of wheat direct drilled into stripped linseed stubble. I bought a stripper header about 3 years ago, and it's invaluable for cutting crops like linseed, but also if you've got wheat or oat crops which which have still got green straw. It basically speeds up the harvesting process by a third. It reduces the moisture content of the grain coming off the combine. Has got a lower moisture content, and the diesel use is a lot less, which I'll talk to you in a while. Use of cover crops. This is a cover crop last year that was a multi-species cover crop that was direct drilled into, I think it was spring wheat stubble. But what an opportunity for, rather than just having a cover crop over the winter and ploughing it back in or direct drilling into it in the spring, what an opportunity there to bring in livestock over the winter, to cut the livestock feeding costs, which are the bulk of the costs in a livestock system, is the feeding and housing them and bedding them and so on. Just out of interest, also this is companion cropping. This is a 3-species crop of oats, peas, and oilseed rape. I think I only put 20 kilos of nitrogen on that field, and that was after 2 years of cereal crops. So in an organic system, you'd have thought the land would have been hungry a bit for a bit of nitrogen, because it will have all been taken out of the ground. But it's amazing. There must be some sort of fertility, direct, nitrogen to be taken up by the grasses and the brassicas in that, or the cereals and the brassicas, and there must be some nitrogen moving across there, because otherwise that crop would look, those brassicas and the oats would not look so healthy. This is a photo of the mob grazing. This is the winter, and trying to reduce the winter feed costs is using deferred grazing. Alex touched on that. That was so I'm not going to go into that too much, but I have been able to reduce my wintering costs quite considerably by keeping the cattle outside longer and longer over the last 5 years. The stripper header and linseed. This is the fuel use over the 5 years. So, okay, I've been farming since 1998 without using the plough and the conventional part of the farm. So, but I've only been measuring fuel use over the last 4 years or so. But what's staggering is the cattle per hectare on a fairly extensive system, as they were anyway, were using more litres per hectare on fuel than the arable side. And on the arable side, I mean stubble to stubble fuel use. But another highlight is how much I spend on drying a crop, which exceeds both the arable litres per hectare and the cattle litres per hectare. Last year was an exception with a very dry harvest, but it just highlights where the fuel goes, and the fuel is a good indicator on your depreciation costs and your labor costs as well. That's winter cover crop. This is in Christmas Day, I think it was 2018. That's what I like to see. I like to see sort of a healthy rhizosphere around the roots, which means hopefully the soil's pretty healthy in that respect. That crop had that multi-species cover crop had no artificial inputs, no inputs in apart from the seed, direct drill seed into the previous stubble in the autumn. And it yielded, I don't know if you can see that, I think it yielded roughly 15 tons per hectare of fresh weight, which is equated to 1.65 tons of dry matter a hectare. And I did a leaf analysis at the end of, a leaf tissue analysis at the end of November, and there's nothing wanting in that crop at all, apart from boron and molybdenum. And that was quite a staggering, because every time I try to grow, I've got to be truthful, every time I try to grow a decent cash crop and I do leaf tissue analysis, it's all over the place. And I think I could put that down a lot to it, this use of synthetic inputs. So that's just a speculative comment there. But the nitrogen taken up by the crop, which equated exactly, the potash take up of that crop was roughly in the region of, well, it was 73 kilos of nitrogen per hectare taken up by that plant, locked up by that plant, and those nutrients were all locked up by that plant. Hopefully they would be available to the following crop, and not only to the following crop in years to come. So there's a bigger legacy effect of, I think there's a big legacy effect of using cover crops. One thing about the carbon, and Audrey will probably correct me and slap me for coming up with a comment like this, but it's the roots, as far as I believe, it's the roots that put the carbon into the soil. It was traditionally possibly thought the decay or decay of the crops or the trash or the chopped straw put the carbon in the soil, but no, it's the roots that put the bulk of through the root exits that put the bulk of the carbon into the soil. So that's why I try to have a living root in the soil the whole time, and which leads me on to the fact the perennials got a huge part to play, and I think we forget to. It'll be great if we could have perennial cash cropping, and I think hopefully there'll be a lot of research into this in the future, and I hope Henry's listening to this to see if he can push SRUC down that route rather than planting annuals. But there again, on the flip side of the coin, annuals have a big part to play in annuals have a big part to play in perennial systems as well. And you can see that probably with the organic systems. You build up fertility after 3 or 4 years and then release that fertility. You build up the fertility in a grass lay or a glass clover lay after 3 or 4 years, and you release that fertility to grow some cereal crops or cash crops for a couple of years. And I don't know where that sits quite with selling carbon offsets if you're a farmer signed up to that, but I've not really got much experience with that yet. And I just want to share a slide of that's winter rye direct drilled into a grass sward, a young grass sward, because winter rye comes up. The rye comes up very quickly in the spring. It gets a very good early bite for cattle. And this was probably in May. I think this was taken in May, and the rye is headed. And I put my cattle in there and moved them daily on that. And they didn't seem to bother about it at all. They loved it. You can, if you can see them. And that's just another cover picture of a cover crop that I took the analysis of in November 2018.
I'm not sure if we can see those pictures actually, Doug.
Oh, you didn't see them. Okay, sorry. I don't. No, obviously not. No, sorry about that. But there are just 2 external pictures that I pulled up.
Yeah, unfortunately, that's not
and soil health, as Audrey mentioned earlier on, it's not all about carbon. My organic matters. I've taken organic matter content readings on my field since 2006, which is when I started organic, some part of the farm. In total, I've taken 120 fields sampled for organic matter. The average organic matter over that time has been, I had it written down here. It was in the region of 5%, just on the high 4%. Because I'm on light land, heavier land will obviously be able to have higher organic matter. But The organic area, which is mainly grassland, and it's on the top of the farm, a lot of it's on the top of the farm, which is heavier soils. The average organic matter on the organic part of the land is 5.16% soil organic matter in a loss of ignition method. And the conventional, I've taken 93 samples in the conventional fields, and the average there is 4.52. Analyzing it from when I started taking organic matter contents to now, I might have come up by 0.5% in 20 years, or since 2006. It's not a fast process, but visually and doing soil structure and aggregate stability tests, and visually and using a spade and seeing the earthworm numbers increase. 2016 was the last time I dug a whole load of pits in the fields in the spring, and I was averaging 34 earthworms in 30 centimeters cubed, which was great. And I put that down to a lot of that down to trash on the surface, which is feed for the worms over the winter and in the spring. If it's bare soil, they're not going to come up to the surface. They don't have any reason to come up to the surface. But I think that is, yeah, they're negligible soil organic matter increases. But visually, like this is two fields next door to each other. One's been ploughed on the same sort of rotation. The other one is direct drilled cover crops, companion cropping, no livestock. But I don't want the soil on the left-hand side with that sediment taking all the nutrients and the phosphates down into the rivers, and I'm exporting my nutrients in that situation. Whereas on the right-hand side, it's a slightly darker color, the soil, which possibly indicates it's got a bit more carbon in it, and it's got fantastic aggregate stability. It's stuck, the glues, the glomalins, that are the glues that hold the soil particles together and indicative of higher mycorrhiza contents, are doing their work. And I would drink that water underneath that soil on the right-hand side. I don't know whether I would on the left, but on the whole, I'm very happy. I've not cracked it, and over the last 20 years, I realize there's a lot more. I probably know a lot more. I've increased my knowledge, but I'm certainly in the situation where there is a lot increasingly aware of what I don't know about farming, but it's a constant strive for perfection, and it's not going to stop now. But thank you very much.
Thanks, Doug. That was great. Yeah, everybody's managed to pack in so much to what was quite a short time to go through the presentations. So we'll kind of open up for questions now. We've got a couple in the Menti, and I wonder the speakers might have questions for each other as well. But I'll start on the first couple of Menti questions, and that can kind of kick us off, and we'll see how we get on. We've only got 20 minutes left, but I think the amount of information that we've just had in the last wee while was really useful. So the first one is towards Alex. For your most marginal rough grazing and presumably upland, what does good condition look like, and why is it better now than what it was?
Okay, we typically we're running over. So in 2012, I sprayed 400 hectares for bracken. That's been one of my biggest challenges. Had to do through helicopters. We can't get across the ground. Underneath that, we would be sort of 70 bracken fronds per metre squared when we started, and a lot of that was moss under that with really simple grasses. I don't actually know if I can maybe pop back in my PowerPoint and drag some slides if you've got time for that, have you? And that might give visuals which might help everybody. Is that allowed? I'll just keep whiffering at the same time if you want me to do that. So just let me scroll down here a wee bit. Does that work, does it? or maybe that one they would give us a view of kind of what we were starting. Can everybody see that? Can you?
Yeah.
Of what we were starting with. So we've managed to go through a lot of that country, trample the grasses, reseed them all, and then knock away through these bracken beds and really reduce the density of them. That's pHing high 4s, 5s. It's not a high pH country at all. But what's happening in there, and I'm going to try and hop slides to show this as I go, is that we're getting certain times of the year, September, October, the cows will eat a lot of that rough grasses, and then we're dropping cow shit on the ground. Around that, we get what I class as a ring of nutrition. So the rumen operates kind of mid-60s pH-wise, and what we're getting around that then is clovers starting to appear in that same rough country that you just saw. We've never sown these clover. That seems to be an indicative seed bank, but that cow shit then breaks down into kind of humus, and then within 2 or 3 years it is part of the soil profile. It will take us quite a long time, but through that sort of means we are able to build up the capacity in the soil just with trampling in seed, epigenetic change in grass seed, getting animals, especially cow shit, into the ground. But within that, I could dig a hole and find very, very few worms in that landscape. Under these cow pats, there is now a huge amount of worms operating, as well as dung beetles. And that biology is really, really speeding up to the point that last week, or we currently have dung beetles operating this now, and I've been told that dung beetles will not operate till it's about plus 12 degrees. We have them operating on the farm today, which I find absolutely mind-blowing. But they seem to be living in the soils, and then they're popping their wee heads up. Here you go. That photograph was taken last week, and that sheep shit on the right there has only been down for 2 or 3 days, and the one on the left was maybe dropped about the 20th, the 22nd of March, and that's been fully broken down with dung beetles. It was just kind of powdery left. So we've really got biology geared in the soil, and that is allowing us to really accelerate in terms of photosynthetic capacity and getting energy back into the farming system. Does that answer that question?
Yeah, great. Thank you.
Can you mention also about the fact that you don't use anthelmintic drugs, because that has a big impact on how much work these dung beetles do?
That's not strictly true. We don't use anthelmintics. We use very little anthelmintics in cattle. We FEC tested the yow flock last week, and they're currently running with a worm burden of about 400 eggs per gram. Right. What we will probably do is drench based on body condition and live weights. We use EID as a major tool in the business, and anything that's kind of struggling we'll treat. But if they're not struggling, we'll just leave them alone.
So you are trying to minimise use.
I'm trying to minimise. We're not blanket drenching, Audrey, definitely not. But then, when that dung beetle's broken that sheep shit apart, then any worm larvae that's in there is really going to struggle to survive, because when the air is passing through it, that sheep shit will dry out. So the worm larvae loses its environment to breed in. So hopefully we can start slowing the cycle down. But I think it's also worth noting that worms, sheep worms and cattle worms, they are part of the process. We've got them, they're here, they're always going to be here, and they always were here. We've just about to tweak how we operate grazing systems to extend rotations, mix up cattle and sheep within these rotations, and try and break down the prevalence of these parasites taking hold.
Yep, very important.
Great. We'll go. There's another couple for Alex around the livestock, and then one for Doug. That they're all sort of livestock related, and then there's a couple for Audrey that we'll go to after. So 2 for Alex. What is the length of your rotations when grazing heather? Does that vary with the season? And then also, can you share anything about the results from your Rock on Soils project, where you used quarry dust on some of the grassland?
Okay, so I think one of the most important things I've probably learned about grazing is is try and build the rotation and the animal impact around the pastures. So if you're needing to get energy into the system, get nitrogen into the land, you've got to allow that plant to express itself. And on poorer country, the rotation length can be anything from 120 days up to 365 days. Or in some of the heather country, it depends what it is we want to achieve. If the land's that rough that we're never going to make a fundamental change to it, we really don't hit it that hard. We'll go through a lot of the flushes, we'll take a nibble, we'll use it as a bit of deferred grazing lightly, and then we'll come away again. In a way, I'm using it to buy time in other parts of the farm. It's probably best grazed late summer, early autumn. This time of year, there's not enough feed value in that country to do any good to any livestock that are operating. I tend to be focusing pretty hard on the bracken areas. I mean, there's an old saying, under bracken there's gold, so the potential to increase the capacity of that landscape is massive. That's where the focus is. Going back to the Rock on Soils project, that was quite an interesting project. I think to make any massive difference on a landscape basis, we needed to be applying it about above 20 tonnes a hectare. And economically, that was never going to stack up for us. It was interesting to do it. That quarry Stura rock dust, I mean, it seemed to percolate its way down through the soil. It had quite a base loading of nutrients in it, which were mostly beneficial. But you've also got to bear in mind that it's the biology and the fungus in the soil that feed the plants, and that the pH around the ribosphere of the root system on the plant is probably far higher than the average bulk pH of the soil. And to that end, I've kind of moved away from it, because in the longer run, it wasn't going to be the best return of investment for the business. There was a far greater return for us for building capacity in these more extensive hectares. So we've kind of pushed a lot more money towards getting fencing systems in place and getting power and getting electric power in place to allow us to manage animal impact further out. And then if we need to get any minor uplifts later on, we'll come back in and revisit that. Again, it was one of these projects that we ran, we got a lot from it, but I think we're achieving greater, more profitable results by getting the pasture management far better higher up.
Great, thank you. I'll pass the next one to Doug, and this is a livestock one rather than an arable one. Doug, did you have to change livestock breed to be able to use deferred grazing or winter grazing?
No, I haven't. But
and what cattle breed do you have actually?
I've got Aberdeen Angus cross cattle. I've always had native breeds, and this year, the last couple of years, I took the cattle in. They're just in for a month and a half. The cows are in just for a month and a half, a couple of months till they calve and they go out. But my ultimate goal is to keep them outside all year round. It's ridiculous. They do so much better outside. The heifers have been outside all year. Last year, I calved 30 heifers and I lost one calf because it was coming backwards, but they all calved outside by themselves. It was ironically the cows are inside, and they didn't have any problems either. But as soon as I bring them inside, you see them going downhill, and that's feeding them more as well of expensive conserved forage. But I have introduced a couple of Hereford Angus cross bulls into the herd, and it'll be interesting to see their progeny try to reduce the cow size. I think my average cow size will be about 650 kilos, but I want it maybe slightly smaller. I want an easily fleshed animal that's be able to sell off the farm within 2 years. I don't want to try to keep them over the second winter. It's a costly business, whether they're outside or inside.
Super. Another one, another livestock one that's just come up for Alex. What are the key points of managing sheep and cattle together for reducing parasite burden?
What's a cracker? We've had a bit of a dabble in this so-called flerding over last summer. It kind of 50% worked, and what I mean by that, if you've got a real consistent pasture ahead of you, therefore the cows are obviously bigger. If you're putting them into a variable feed, then the cows will dominate the higher value feed areas of each break allocation. The sheep will tend to get a bit less. They suffer. What we tend to do is, I suppose the mainstay of what we're doing is we're getting the cows, we're putting the cattle ahead of the sheep. So I use the cattle as a tool to graze the rough off, trample stuff down. The regrowth in behind that is generally quite sweet and far more succulent. It's a bit of feed based for the sheep. And then we'll try and extend that rotation as long as we can, cattle back in behind. So that's roughly how we do it. Lactating ewes, I think they need a far greater feed base than I ever really managed to give them. So I'm not entirely sure how effective flerding is, but I do think that the cattle are really good at resetting residuals. And what I mean is they eat, they trample, you move on, and what you get left is a far more balanced feed than putting the sheep first, where they really select and leave it rougher. And in the country that we're operating in, the cows don't enjoy that very much. So really it's just rotation length.
Thanks. There's a couple that I'm going to pass to Audrey now. The first one being, do you have any comment on SRUC's AgriCalc not taking into account carbon sequestered in grassland? Opinion on that?
I believe they're aware of that, and they're trying to improve AgriCalc all the time. We're just short in data. It's quite early days. And I think a lot of people will be aware that there's massive interest from investors and carbon offsetters out there, and a lot of absolute rubbish talked by people who I won't name about the potential for farmers to earn a fortune by selling carbon offsets from soil carbon sequestration. I'd be very, very worried about, as a farmer, trying to do that. It takes an incredibly long time to sequester carbon in soils. And also it's very difficult to get good, well, a lot of people haven't got the baseline data to prove that they've done that over a relatively short time scale. It's not an easy thing to do. If you want to increase the amount of soil carbon in your own soils, you have to radically change what you're doing, because all soils will be at a kind of equilibrium carbon content or soil organic matter content, depending on how you're managing them. And if you want to change that and sequester carbon, it's a very, very difficult thing to do. And I think both other other speakers today, both Alex and Doug have talked about how long, it's a long game what they're trying to do. They're trying to improve their systems, make them more sustainable, improve soil health. It's a long game, and the length of time it's taken for us to destroy our soils, it's probably several decades. I'm not saying that either of the other two speakers have destroyed their soils, although they've acknowledged there have been problems when they began their kind of regenerative journeys. So it's taken us decades as a country to destroy our soils. It will take, in many cases, decades to improve them. But at the end of that journey, if there is ever an end, we won't probably have increased soil organic matter contents by an awful lot. So it's a very dangerous thing to try to do, to think about selling carbon sequestered in that way. What you would want to do, of course, is use it as part of your own journey towards net zero. But even that, you're not going to be getting a lot of carbon credits from doing that in the short term, because it's just such a difficult thing to do. I think AgriCalc will probably be including that in future. Well, they've said they will, as more research data becomes available on exactly how to do it. But it's complicated because every farm's different, every soil's different, every soil texture is different, and management systems are different. So we won't have all the details we need yet to be able to make that program work.
Thanks.
or that's part
Yes.
of that very good programme work.
Yeah, it's sort of ever evolving.
So yes, and quite rapidly, has to be said, but it's not there yet.
We've got another couple, maybe Alex or Audrey might be able to comment on where do you get a fungal bacterial ratio done, and how do you use it to tweak your management? So as part of a sort of soil test, how would you get that tested?
It's really only done by the microbiology labs. I've used soil biolab in the past. There's a couple of them, these labs. You just have to look up soil microbiology testing. That's where to get it done. It's not terribly expensive, but unfortunately, there are people like Elaine Ingham and others who will tell you that they understand how to interpret that data. And I think it's fairly accurate to say that if you get a certain result, then we know various things that we can do to change that. And somebody, I can't remember which one of the two other speakers said that, I think it was Alex, that in most soils which are in which synthetic fertilizers are used fairly intensively, then the amount of bacteria relative to the amount of fungi tends to be quite high. So intensive arable systems and intensive livestock systems, you tend to have fewer fungi and more bacteria, and that's purported by certain soil health experts, including this woman Elaine Ingham, that's not a good thing, and what you should be aiming for is more fungi and a higher fungal to bacterial ratio. I broadly agree with that, but we don't really have, we've got recipes whereby you can help improve that ratio by, for example, adding more crop residues, using less synthetic fertilizers and pesticides, using fewer cultivations, for example, because cultivations smash up fungal networks. So we know lots of things we can do to improve that ratio, but what we really don't have is proof of what it actually means if your fungal bacterial ratios are perfect, as somebody like that would see it. Because it's perfectly possible to get extremely good crop yields in intensive agricultural systems with lots of synthetic fertilizers. Intensive agriculture works. It just has a lot of downsides. Well, in my mind, it does anyway. It has a lot of downsides, probably mainly in terms of the environment, and possibly in some cases animal health and crop health. So you've got to keep doing it. But we don't have as much, we can't yet fully interpret we don't have a good interpretive framework, I would argue, for interpreting the results of that type of microbiological tests. We know how to alter our systems to get the kind of ratios that people like Elaine Ingham would say we need, but we don't quite know what it's going to mean in terms of crop yields, for example, or animal productivity.
Yeah, but yeah, I think the sort of general sort of recurring themes of kind of keeping soil covered, returning trash, having living roots, all those kind of things tend towards the sort of better kind of balance. I'm just very aware of time, and one or two folk having to dash off to other meetings. We've not quite got through all of the questions yet, and so before people start dropping off, if Jane can add the link into the chat, please, for the feedback form. We've got a feedback form that we'd really appreciate if people filled out before they kind of go off and do something else, just because it helps us kind of inform future work and report to our funders and things. And also really like to thank all of our speakers, Audrey, Doug and Alex, and also Jane in the background that's been sort of helping us keep everything going. And thank you to the funding from Scottish Government's Knowledge Transfer Innovation Fund. And so I'll sort of do the thanks, and then if anybody is really keen to kind of hang around for another 5 minutes, we can go through those couple of questions if the speakers are happy to stay. But if you're short of time, we can finish it there and maybe follow up a couple through emails. So there was one to Audrey from Doug, asking if you're seeing much difference between soil samples taken in field and under the hedge.
Yes, very much so. Massive difference in organic matter content between under the hedge and conventional arable fields, certainly. A difference of maybe 2 or 3% in terms of soil organic matter in the cultivated field. As I say, this is not an organic system, and it's conventional arable with cereal rotations mainly. So yeah, a difference of 2 or 3% in organic matter, much lower earthworm numbers in the field than there is under the hedge. I've not done any comparisons in organic farming systems in that respect, but I have done quite a few comparisons between not just hedges, but beetle banks and no spread zones as well for fertilizer. And it's, yeah, the difference is profound.
Yeah, that's crazy. And one last one for Doug. I think then that might be the last of the questions. Doug, if you're still okay for a minute or two, are you chemically desiccating your cover crops prior to direct drilling?
I wondered when that question was come up. Yes, but I forgot to, the presentation was a bit short, but that's why I'm wanting to bring perennials back into my arable stockless system, the direct drilling system, because it hasn't seen livestock for 30 years. And I think perennials got a huge part to play. I think they've got enormous part to play. And forget what the methane emissions of cows and things like that just for a moment, because I think the sum of the advantages of having cattle or sheep or herbivores or animals in an arable situation way outweigh it. And but coming back to glyphosate, no, I don't like it. I'm wanting to. I reckon maybe cattle or sheep have a part to play in desiccating the crop, but still are going to get grass weeds. And I just don't like to be beholden by one chemical, and it's not right. So that's why I'm converting a lot more of my farm to organic for 5 years anyway, to get perennials back into the system, do a reset, because weeds are getting out of control a bit. Well, I'm keeping them under control this now, but they're getting more reliant. Chemicals are not the way to go. I'm having to use a bit more chemistry on the herbicide front, but less on the fungicide front.
And I think there's been a couple of field labs done down south by innovative farmers on direct drilling and no-till and organic systems, and kind of mechanically doing that job. And so I think that work's ongoing. So I'll maybe see if we've got any interesting links to further information that we can put in the follow-up emails as well.
And the thing about hoeing, it's great, it's brilliant, but in the spring and the peak bird nesting season, what's going to happen to the yellowhawk, the skylark eggs? And it's everything in agriculture compromise, isn't it? It's so complex.
Yeah. Great. Okay, I think we've managed to get through most of those questions. Thank you again so much to our speakers and all the attendees, all the people that have asked questions and commented. I think that's been a really great session. We've got through quite a lot in an hour and a half. So thanks very much to everyone, and we'll let you all go and enjoy the rest of your afternoon. And we'll send out the recording of this webinar, plus the other webinar and all the other resources that are coming along with it in one kind of big summary blog and email in a couple of weeks' time. So thanks very much, and cheerio.
Cheers. Thanks, guys. Bye-bye.